Okay, so welcome to today's Detmold Saxophone talk about Sigurd Raschèr and Ali-Ben-Sou-Alle. So, Andy, why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay, so it's my nemesis, screen sharing, but here we go. I think we're in good shape. Right, we're all there? Okay, so I'm going to talk about Charles Jean-Baptiste Sou-Alle, or as he was known professionally, Ali-Ben-Sou-Alle. This is part of my doctoral research, which will be very shortly, hopefully, handed in for DMA at the University of Illinois. The project is supervised jointly by Deborah Richtmeier and Christina Bashford, who is an eminent musicologist on 19th century British concert life. So they've been immensely helpful. So what I'm researching is Sou-Alle's appropriation of Scottish culture from Scotland. And in his repertoire, there's a number of pieces that are based on the works of Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott. And so I'm examining those from a historical, musicological, and a cultural point of view. But today, what I'm going to do is do a more general survey of the man himself and his importance for the saxophone. Part of what my research was doing is I constructed a chronology of his career and then put these Scottish pieces in there. And in so doing, I've created a chronology that perhaps challenges some existing literature and perhaps adds to some other ideas about himself and his motivations and so on. So that will come in. And I'll tell you what is maybe current and what is mine as we go through. So a little bit about his early life and career. He was French, born near Calais, in northern France, in July 1824. He trained his clarinet player under Closet, famous pedagogue at the Paris Conservatoire. He relocated to London in 1848, essentially to do with the political upheavals in France around that time. And there is, to date, I have not managed to find any definite date for him adopting the saxophone. However, we have a date for his first documented saxophone performance, which is November 1850, and I'll go into that in a minute. And throughout the early 1850s, he performed throughout Britain and Ireland under the auspices of an impresario called Louis Antoine Julien, again, who we'll talk about. Subsequently, he went solo, like all great artists do, and he embarked on a solo tour of European colonies throughout Asia and Africa, essentially, which lasted until about 1860. So just a little bit of where I'm getting this from, and maybe there's these kind of two bodies of literature in French, literature in English, and these will sort of play off each other a wee bit as we go through. Essentially, there is a very influential French narrative about this individual, about Sou-Alle, called La Fortune et la Clarinette, excuse my pronunciation. Like all people brought up in British education, foreign languages are not my strong point, so to my detriment. Anyway, essentially, this is a really romanticized narrative about Sou-Alle journeying through India and playing his clarinet or saxophone, depending on the version you read, to a Maharaja and becoming his employee and all this kind of stuff. And it's all these crazy exotic language about elephant leg trees, and it's fantastical. But essentially what that did, it was republished about 4 times up until about 1880 and formed a body of literature in French which centers around this narrative in India. And that follows through into these modern French language articles by the two down there labeled as journal articles, and which have formed actually a lot of the discourse about Sou-Alle, and generally have filtered through into books like, for example, the Cambridge Companion to the Saxophone in English, a few other earlier journal articles. However, recently, there's been a little bit of a renaissance in studies of this individual. Actually, I think probably because, one, I was joking with Diana, probably because people have dissertations to write because they're doing DMAs, might be one of the reasons, but also I think because of the availability of searchable online archives. we've been able to look into this man's career, particularly outside of Western Europe, and it's really changed the way we look at things. Stephen Cottrell, who's a book by Yale University Press, I recommend. It's a really wonderful survey of the saxophone. He writes about Sou-Alle, and then he actually carries on in a subsequent article where he does a lot of good work in terms of tying the persona, which we'll learn about, to themes of Orientalism and so on. And then these two other dissertations, which people I've never met, but perhaps are slightly colleagues at this point, who have looked at his activities in various countries as part of studies in his tour. And again, I've done a lot of good work about digging into what actually happened from primary literature. So my own research has done similarly. I've spent a lot of time in the British Library. Essentially, you can access any newspaper published in Britain from the 1600s. And so I've put together a lot of primary research about him from there, and some scores as well. The University of Sydney have published this whole archive of early music making in early colonial and federal Australia. And I've relied on that a lot as well. And I've learned a lot about what he did in Australia. And that's where I learned a lot about this Scottish repertoire. That's the main focus of my research. And then I've also spent a lot of time reading other publications by essentially colonial authorities in Asia and in South Africa, translating some stuff from Dutch, which was fun, but essentially all of that. And the availability of these, I think, allowing us to maybe rewrite this story. So it starts, however, back in 1850, back when we discovered that Sou-Alle was going to play the saxophone. And it centers around this piece by the impresario and composer Louis Anton Julien, whose orchestra Sou-Alle played in, called the Great Exhibition Quadrille. Now, the Great Exhibition was a massive, essential exercise in British imperial hubris. It took place in London in 1851 and was essentially there to show off the glories of Britain and the Empire to the rest of the world, and have everyone be very impressed with Queen Victoria. And it's a part of history that maybe here in the UK we're seeking to reevaluate and see it for what it was. But within the kind of fever of this time, this piece, the Great Exhibition Quadrille, was this musical evocation of the moment. We see here, it's this enormous piece, this massive long program note. We see the date of the premiere there in November 1850. And this is a picture from a review of the premiere, just to see the scale of it from this point. So the gentleman with the baton and the waistcoat and the belly, that's Julien. And then you see the size of the orchestra. This is the man on the podium is a French drum major. They had a French drum corps as part of the performance. Unfortunately, I've looked and looked at this and I cannot see anything that looks like a saxophone. So he must be just out of shot. But what you need to appreciate is the scale of this event. Back to the program note, that little section I've ringed there. You can see this introduction to number 3, the Aurora Serenade, a Sicilian lover to his mistress. Cornamusa solo by Monsieur Sou-Alle, a harp legato. So we know this is Sou-Alle performing, and he's playing this instrument called the cornamusa. We don't quite understand what that is at this point, except it will become clear. But the point is actually this is an orchestral solo, what we're seeing here, a really prominent orchestral solo. Descriptions of the cornamusa appear in reviews. This is a slightly later one from 1852, and I just put it in because it's the best, it's the most funny. But it's also, they appear from 1850, but the more morphological description, we observed 2 new instruments in the orchestra, and it goes on to say, it's made of brass with a reed, the mouthpiece of a clarinet, bristles with keys, and has the bowl of a horn. And I think really that sounds like an alto saxophone. I think we're without doubt. And there are so many of these that consistently lay out this same sort of form, physical form. So the piece is really significant because Julien then toured this around the rest of the UK. After Sou-Alle left his orchestra, he actually toured it to the United States. And so there's this little musical moment that I think until now has been a bit obscure. I decided to see if I could find it. A lot of writing around this, for example, Fred Henke's dissertation, he mentions how this is a really significant musical moment for the saxophone. I kind of was like, okay, I'm going to find this. He was my master's teacher. And I sadly didn't quite get to show him this before we lost him, but I managed to find an arrangement of the Great Exhibition Quadrille in the British Library without a saxophone part or cornemuse part. But I got the score and I managed to find the section that we labeled the Aurora Serenade, which is put in a clarinet there. This supposed harp obbligato is dubiously scored for E-flat clarinet, if you can imagine. And the rest of the harmonic rhythm is there and the rest of the orchestra. So basically, it's a little bit of a reimagining, I suppose. We can't be exactly sure, but I think with a great degree of certainty, this rescoring it for alto saxophone, we've kind of, I hope to have recreated this musical moment, which is actually the introduction of the saxophone in 1850 to England, to Scotland, to Ireland, and actually in 1853 after so I left to the United States as well in New York. So as we look at the saxophone part, it's you can see it's pretty well written. You know, it sits in that really sort of friendly, you know, just over the break register. It's a little bit virtuosic, you know, the 16th notes, and there's a wee cadenza at the end. And it's really quite expressive. And I kind of like to think of this as, I don't know if any of you do professional like symphonic work, but whenever I've been in that situation, you have that moment when you come in, say in Pictures in an Exhibition or Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances, where the audience goes, what's that sound? And I just like to imagine that perhaps what is this experience for this audience in 1850 in London, 1852 in Edinburgh, which was really important for me, that it's actually to imagine what that moment must have been for this audience who had never heard the saxophone before in any context. And so I usually have, you know, performed this with a piano reduction whenever I've done a lecture recital, and through the glories of IT, I have lost the little recording I did with a harpist friend of mine, which I'll have to redo. So apologies, but even just seeing the score is kind of illustrative. So that is the Great Exhibition Quadrille. After this piece, Sou-Alle leaves Julien's orchestra, and as I said, he decides to go solo. You'll see throughout this, I'm using this map. This is a map that's very sort of familiar to those of us in the UK. Again, something where we have to reassess, but the famous pink spots is essentially the British Empire. And this used to hang up in classrooms all over the country. And it was a kind of, again, a hubristic enterprise. But the reason I'm using this is because actually Sou-Alle's solo tour, as I've managed to piece it together from the primary sources, essentially follows the British Empire. He spends a significant amount of time in the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. But a lot of the rest of it is in Anglophone environments. And I think this is partly why the literature has changed from these early French language articles, which concentrate on fantastical narratives of India. I think that the difference here is because in reality, he spent the majority of his career in an Anglophone environment. So he sails directly to Australia, and he arrives in Melbourne in June 1853. And as soon as he arrives in Melbourne, the press, the Argus, which is the main Melbourne newspaper, referred to him as the celebrated Ali-Ben-Sou-Alle. So between performing the Great Exhibition Quadrille in 1852 and then turning up in Australia in 1853, he has become this figure. And we know here it says his wonderful turcophone. So he started calling his saxophones turcophones as part of the thing. And we see that he has a grand national costume. And then we see in this second quote from later in the article that he had, I suppose, fed to these newspapers. I don't know where else they would have got the information other than maybe his own chatter behind the scenes, that he's of Turkish extraction. So he's created this essentially kind of brown-faced persona, as we would probably see it just now. And again, it feels uncomfortable as cultural appropriation. But the significance here is that this happened in 1853 and is a self-generated project. And I think is part of his launching this solo career beginning in Australia. And this is important to note because actually in a lot of the earlier literature, the name and the costume and the name for the saxophone is associated with this fantastical narrative in India and his employment by an Indian royalty and so on and so on. As we'll go through, we will talk about India, but records show that he didn't reach India until 1857. So this is a long way before. So he set himself up as Ali-Ben-Sou-Alle, and he has his Turcophone in Melbourne in June 1853. And here he is. This is a picture of him. This photograph is the only known photograph that I've been able to find. It's held by the British National Archives at Kew, and it's actually from 1864. It's a little later, but it gives us his costume and his Turcophone, which clearly looks like a straight alto saxophone. And also, I should say, it's reproduced in Stephen Cottrell's article for the Journal of the American Musical Instrument Association, excuse me. That's where I first encountered it, cite your sources. But it is readily accessible through the British National Archives. But I was kind of wondering, where would he have got the specifics of this costume in 1853 in Australia and in this kind of very obviously Turkish milieu? So we'll look into that later. But here also is the Turcophone. This is a patent that he filed in 1860 in Paris. What we can see in dark is the bits that are actually the Turcophone. Now these are really, you can see Boehm system pinky keys, low note fingerings, and you can see this kind of essentially an automatic octave mechanism. The changes he made to the instrument are these, they kind of facilitate virtuosity as opposed to really creating anything intrinsically different in the instrument. The sound, the response, all these kind of essential saxophone characteristics perhaps are the same. I think probably at the beginning in the 1850s, he would have played Adolf sax instruments. If he was playing a concert in 1850, it must have been an Adolf sax instrument, I would think, as far as I can tell from reading around. Perhaps the 1864 instrument that's pictured is a different maker. But either way, the point with the Turcophone really here is, from everything I've read about descriptions of the sound and so on, I don't think the saxophone is intrinsically different, other than the fact that there is a keyword that facilitates virtuosity. The Turcophone term is not a new instrument. It's really part of this persona. And so back to the persona. I looked around at this kind of Orientalist thing. Cottrell does a great job of linking to this general themes of Orientalism. And I looked at Orientalist art. There's a specific sort of thread of French academic art known as Orientalism, which is to do with oil paintings of the Middle East, or what we now call the Middle East. I think the male figures in here give us more of a clue to where this costume and so on came from. I think this is a milieu that was around, Paris was known as the home of Orientalism. And I think this is a milieu where he would have seen these paintings, the man pictured in the photograph. He would have seen these images of men, and I think it's something he would have quite readily soaked up. Also, just to kind of connect it even further, this is a cover for a piano reduction of the Great Exhibition Quadrille. And we see again a very similar figure in the corner there. A very similar form of clothing, and side by side, they kind of, to me, it feels pretty matched. The other thing that I discovered in looking at his Australian performances is one particular piece called the Turco-Russian Historical Polka, which was essentially another grand orchestral piece, just like the Great Exhibition Quadrille, but was on themes of the early conflicts that were a part of the lead up to the Crimean War. Now, in the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and the French were allied against the Russians. And as he was performing in Australia, what you see from the press reviews of these is an enormous enthusiasm for Ottoman culture, for Turkish cultural symbols, a real patriotic duty to support these allies. And with reading through this review of this premiere of the Turco-Russian Historical Polka, he the reviewer brings up these two conflicts, Caliphate and Altanitsa, which are again two skirmishes early in the conflict, and talks about the appreciation of the performance, the beauties of the Turcophone and the dress as enhancing the telling of this narrative. And so my sense is, again, taking from this theme, which goes all the way back to the Great Exhibition quadrille, of capitalizing on this, the moment and the tastes of the public in the moment and the cultural moment, and creating performances that then mirror that, I think is more to do with this Turkish persona in costume than anything else. Essentially, my conclusion is that it's a business choice as opposed to anything else. He's created a shtick that he can sell to the populations of these British colonies where everybody is getting behind this cause of this Anglo-Ottoman alliance. In my other research, where I'm looking at these, my kind of actual dissertation, where I'm looking at these appropriations of Robert Burns in Scottish culture, there's a piece which is a parody of the Highland bagpipes, and the audience connect this performance to the British Army fighting in the Crimea, and they talk all about the gallant Highlanders, and it's this kind of whole sort of noble savage narrative that we kind of have. And it's, again, remarkable how quickly we get from this performance to the Crimean War in this moment. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that this particular persona arrived at this time in this